Chapter 3 of High Adventure, a narrative of air fighting in France, by James Norman Hall. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. High Adventure, a narrative of air fighting in France, by James Norman Hall. Chapter 3. By the Route of the Air. The winter of 1916 and 17 was the most prolonged and bitter that France had known in many years. It was a trying period to the little group of Americans assembled at École Militaire d'Aviation, eager as they were to complete their training and to be ready, when spring should come, to share in the great offensive which they knew would then take place on the Western Front. Aviation is a waiting game at the best of seasons. In winter it is a series of seemingly endless delays. Day after day, the plain on the high plateau overlooking the old city of V was storm-swept, a forlorn and desolate place as we looked at it from our windows, watching the flocks of crows as they beat up against the wind, or as they turned and were swept with it over our barracks, crying and calling derisively to us as they passed. "Birdmen, you call yourselves," they seemed to say. "Then come on up. The weather's fine." Well, they knew that we were impostors, fair-weather flyers, who dared not accept their challenge. It is strange how vague and shadowy my remembrance is of those long weeks of inactivity, when we were dependent for employment and amusement on our own devices. To me there was a quality of unreality about our life at B. Our environment was, no doubt, partly responsible for this feeling. Although we were not far distant from Paris, less than an hour by train, the country round about our camp seemed to be quite cut off from the rest of the world, with the exception of our Sunday afternoons of leave, when we joined the boulevardiers in town. We lived a life as remote and cloistered as that of some brotherhood of monks in an inaccessible monastery. That is how it appeared to me, although here again I am in danger of making it seem that my own impressions were those of all the others. This, of course, was not true. The spirit of the place appealed to us, individually, in wildly different ways, and upon some, perhaps, it had no effect at all. Sometimes we spent our winter afternoons of enforced leisure in long walks through country roads, which lay empty to the eye for miles. They gave one a sense of loneliness which colored thought, not in any sentimental way, but in a manner very natural and real. The war was always in the background of one's musings, and though we were far removed from actual contact with it, every depopulated country village brought to mind the sacrifice which France has made for the cause of all freedom-loving nations. Every roadside café, long barren of its old patronage, was an evidence of the completeness of the sacrifice. Americans, for the most part, are of an unconquerably healthy cast of mind, but there were few of us who could frequent these places light-heartedly. Paris was our emotional storehouse, to use Kipling's term. During the time we were at B, we spent our Sunday afternoons there, mingling with the crowds on the boulevards, or in pleasant weather sitting outside the cafés, watching the soldiers of the world go by. The streets were filled with permissionnaires from all parts of the Western Front, and there were many of those, despised of all the rest, embusqués as they were called, who held comfortable billets in safe places well back of the lines. It was very easy to distinguish them from the men newly arrived from the trenches, in whose eyes one saw the look of wonder, almost of unbelief, that there was still a goodly world to be enjoyed. It was often beyond the pathetic to see them trying to satisfy their need for all the wholesome things of life in a brief 7 days of leave, to see the family parties at the modest restaurants on the side streets, making merry in a kind of forced way, as if every one were thinking of the brevity of the time for such enjoyment. Scarcely a week went by without bringing one or two additional recruits to the Franco-American Corps. We wondered why they came so slowly. There must have been thousands of Americans who would have been not only willing but glad to join us, and yet the opportunities for doing so had been made widely known. For those who did come, this was the legitimate by-product of glorious adventure and a training in aviation not to be surpassed in Europe. This was to be had by any healthy young American, almost for the asking. But our numbers increased very gradually from 15 to 25, until by the spring of 1917 there were 50 of us at the various aviation schools of France. Territorially, we represented at least a dozen states from the Atlantic to the Pacific. There were rich men's sons and poor men's sons among our number, the sons of very old families, and those who neither knew nor cared what their antecedents were. The same was true of our French comrades, for membership in the French air service is not based upon wealth or family position or political influence. The policy of the government is as broad and democratic as may be. Men are chosen because of an aptitude that promises well, or as a reward for distinguished service at the front. A few of the French enlisted pilots had been officers, but most of them NCOs and private soldiers in infantry or artillery regiments. This very wide latitude in choice at first seemed laxitude to some of us Americans, but evidently experience in training war pilots and the practical results obtained by these men at the front have been proof enough for the French authorities of the folly of setting rigid standards, making hard and fast rules to be met by prospective aviators. As our own experience increased, we saw the wisdom of a policy which is more concerned with a man's courage, his self-reliance, and his powers of initiative, than with his ability to work out theoretical problems in aerodynamics. There are many French pilots with excellent records of achievement in war flying, who have but a sketchy knowledge of motor and aircraft construction. Some are college-bred men, but many more have only a common school education. It is not at all strange that this should be the case, for one may have had no technical training worth mentioning. One may have only a casual speaking acquaintance with motors, and a very imperfect idea of why and how one is able to defy the law of gravity, and yet prove his worth as a pilot in what is, after all, the best possible way, by his record at the front. A judicious amount of theoretical instruction is, of course, not wanting in the aviation schools of France, but its importance is not exaggerated. We Americans, with our imperfect knowledge of the language, lost the greater part of this. The handicap was not a serious one, and I think I may truthfully say that we kept pace with our French comrades. The most important thing was to gain actual flying experience, and as much of it as possible. Only in this way can one acquire a sensitive ear to motors, and an accurate sense of flying speed, the feel of one's machine in the air. These are of the greatest importance. Once the pilot has developed the airman's sixth sense, he need not, and never does, worry about the scantiness of his knowledge of the theory of flight. Sometimes the winds would die away and the thick clouds lift, and we would go joyously to work on a morning of crisp, bright winter weather. Then we had moments of glorious revenge upon the crows. They would watch us from afar, holding noisy indignation meetings in a row of weather-beaten trees at the far side of the field. And when some inexperienced pilot lost control of his machine and came crashing to earth, they would take the air in a body, circling over the wreckage, cawing and jeering with the most evident delight. The Oriental Wrecking Company, as the Ammonites were called, were on the scene almost as quickly as our enemies, the crows. They were a familiar sight on every working day, chattering together in their high-pitched gutturals as they hauled away the wrecked machines. They appeared to side with the birds, and must have thought us the most absurd of men, making wings for ourselves, and always coming to grief when we tried to use them. We made progress regardless of all this skepticism. It was necessarily slow, for beginners at a single command monoplane school are permitted to fly only under the most favorable weather conditions. Even then, old Mother Earth, who is not kindly disposed towards those of her children who leave her so jauntily, would clutch us back to her bosom whenever we gave her the slightest opportunity, with an embrace that was anything but tender. We were inclined to think rather highly of our